In this episode of Radical Priorities, we're talking about war. Probably the latest war to be considered is that of the Israel and Iran conflict. Israel engaged in a preemptive strike, shooting or looking to shoot effectively nuclear sites, killing certain nuclear scientists, but basically beginning the hot portion of what has been for many years now a Cold War. I mean, the truth is, I think it's a bit more of Netanyahu's madness, looking to extend a very fragile administration that he runs. People are already in Israel deeply dissatisfied with, the bringing back the hostage strategy. It's not worked. And Netanyahu seems to have made a bit of a method of by using war, whether it's against the Palestinians or the Houthis or in Syria or it's now in Iran. This is a kind of strategy at the moment and a way of avoiding any sense of, on the one hand, avoiding responsibility for the wars, for the carnage, for the collapsing global consensus. But it's also, in a way, a reaction to the fact that no obvious, let's call it post-liberal solution has really appeared.
Right. Well, I mean, my thinking this entire week, and I mean, essentially, my whole life, and especially kind of revamped since the conflict in Gaza started, is that, war, it seems almost outdated. It seems very ancient. It's obviously a very, primitive sort of concept of dealing with things, right? Is like kill or be killed. And that, it almost seems like we have to be forced into these primitive ways of understanding it. And as the world becomes kind of more confusing and the conflicts and the enemies become less certain, there is this like obfuscation of it in this way. We know that Iran supports Gaza. We have to do these preemptive strikes. There have been talks. There's been heated political discussion, all these things. And it just seems, I don't know, really, really difficult to process. I mean, it's this thing that seems so out of place kind of in the modern world. And yet seems more and more difficult to process because the way that you integrate something like that into a hyper-modern, postmodern society, whatever you want to call it, is to make it something that's very, very difficult to deal with and difficult to understand. And so I find that oftentimes the analysis kind of falls short when it's very factual or even when it's very political and considers the personalities and tensions. I find that, no matter how much news I watch or reports I read or whatever, I'm not able to make any more sense out of it, which to me, I think speaks to your point that it is a result and it's purposeful, that it relates to this sort of, collapsing idea of the liberal order and of enemy and state.
It's like the concepts don't work. The normal boundaries of the liberal state don't really work. I mean, Israel has sort of faced this existential threat where even threats to the concept of Israel are basically considered to be, as dangerous and as real as active military threats. I mean, that says a lot about the mentality of Israel. And the question that I think we have to ask is whether or not Israel, as a specific instantiation of the liberal state, is the answer to be real, the Holocaust. And I think that given that we see the emergence of this endless war syndrome, and we've seen it in the Americans, in many ways these conflicts remind one of Iraq and the claims about weapons of mass destruction by Saddam Hussein, and the same claims get repeated here, to your point that there's something about factual discourse that doesn't work here. I mean, there's that line, of course, that, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Some people like to reverse it. Politics is the continuation of war by other means. In any event, there isn't a clear metric about how we're supposed to be measuring even our sense of global investment in conflicts. And there's an explosion of extremism, I would argue, on both sides. The crisis in Gaza sort of really notwithstanding, the depth of the desperation there, it still not clear, I think, even for people on the left, that they have an answer politically, though. I think the answer is, well, we need to deal with this war question, but it's a rather narrow and obscure and vague kind of political project. And in many ways, actually, it appears to me as if the claim of the left is we need to go back to liberalism, because what Palestine is a giant, basically anti-colonial revolution. That's how it's argued, i.e., it's a revolution fought on the basis of gaining state rights. And I wonder whether, globalism was numb a little bit to the hypocrisy, to some extent, of this, or the fact that the Israel-Palestine conflict has never been satisfactorily resolved. But regardless, I don't know whether the state solution works for Palestine, and Israel has rejected it at their own peril. I mean, is it not the case that Israel has also rejected, in a sense, the naive state boundaries on which they would seek to negotiate this very conflict? It's not clear to me what their other option is, but their disinterest in liberalism, backed at the moment by an American administration, which sort of compared to Netanyahu seems quite calm and collected, but which is similarly disengaging from all the basic facets of the liberal contract.
Well, if you go back, it seems really crazy. I mean, if you take the Israeli logic to its logical extent, and if you even go and look at what people were saying at the time, the idea that, there's this incredibly persecuted group of people that have suffered the worst genocide in history that was, so qualified as horrible because it was so modern, because it was using, industry and calculations in this way that was both so modern and so brutal, that the response to that is there needs to be a globally policed, globally protected ethno-state for these people in which they will not be persecuted. It's totally crazy. It's totally a crazy contract to negotiate, regardless of statehood or liberal ideas of state. It's totally bonkers at this point. And I don't think that Palestinians are arguing for their own sort of ethno-state, but they are arguing for statehood in a way that it's like, the Israelis are almost right to abandon, but they abandon it in the worst way possible, that they should be something bigger than a state, that they should be this kind of superpower that is reminiscent of the United States, and because they have these ties to the United States. But it just seems to totally, screw everyone over. And again, it feels at once very, very dated and yet also very, very modern. I think we also see this in the response. I mean, we were sending things back and forth that were totally crazy to look at. There was like an AI Lego version that summarized the Iranian attack on Israel and Israel's response, and it was like some horrible, ridiculous. It was like the Trump Gaza thing, but explaining the conflict. So I'm seeing that, and then I'm scrolling, and the next thing that I see is a mother in Gaza whose 4 children have been killed, who's, almost like crying tears of joy. She's happy because she says they're martyrs. They'll live on as martyrs. They suffered in life. And then the response to this woman is people saying at once either, oh, she's a fanatic, this is the average person in Palestine, this is how you get, your Hamas government. And then also people saying, this is someone in shock, this is, Stockholm syndrome, whatever, and totally denying the idea that there's like even this ancient concept of martyrdom that is totally related to a holy war that is well established in kind of the human canon, but then not treated it as if like, well, if all of these concepts are breaking down, of course we're returning to these like super primitive understandings. And again, it's just very, very difficult to parse anything out of.
Maybe part of the paradox as well is that, Israel has been a deeply modern state. Certainly that's been the popular conception. The only democracy in the Middle East, right, is the tagline. And yet they have been themselves maybe the most dissatisfied with what the kind of empty values of liberalism provide when you are, at the end of the day, an ethno-state. But I think the ethno-state kind of category for Israel has appeared a little bit retrospectively, a little bit after the fact. I think that there's a lot of leftist rhetoric that wants to go and trace this history back of settler colonialism and British Palestine And and yet I think that the truth is that Israel has only succeeded on the basis that it has reflected a certain kind of globalism in the Middle East and been a foothold for globalism, where other countries simply have not been. Whether it's Iran or Turkey or Saudi Arabia. Of course, increasingly that's becoming less true. Iran is maybe one of those countries, not unlike North Korea, that refuses, in a sense, to self commercialize, at least according to the normal sense in which we mean it in the West. But this dissatisfaction on the part of the Israelis then kind of, or sort of unexpected or unconscious dissatisfaction, then explodes in when you have the coincidence of a new conflict, right? So you have you have October 7th, but then you don't have the liberal backing to say, okay, we're going to support you in this conflict no matter what. Right. Because just like in Ukraine, the Americans had been pushing NATO expansion for decades and aggressively since 2014 in face of Crimea. It's probably not so different. Indeed, let's look at Trump's actions before the preemptive strike by Israel, negotiating with the Saudis, who do not recognize the state of Israel, trying to get them to recognize the state of Israel, having $1 trillion or value to the tune of $1 trillion arms deal, AI deal, trade deal, and similarly Trump trying to negotiate with the Iranians. You could almost see that Netanyahu would be the ultimate, anti-factualist and anti-globalist, and that he's like, well, what are you talking about? The Iranians are never going to do it. And this is maybe the paradox again, as I'm trying to say, where you get the Israelis who need them to be the most progressive state, so long as there continue to be reservoirs of anti-progressive forces. Right. But the moment that Trump attempts to introduce a kind of Pax Americana, a new global order, that doesn't necessarily actually, as far as I can tell, have Israel as, at least as a sort of, financial and military sort of trade entity, which it massively is for both the European Union and the Americans. Again, Israel has, I would say, probably a reduced role to play in Trump's America, principally because, not unlike Trump's strategies with China, he actually wants to create a new kind of global cooperation with these other people who have traditionally been against Israel.
Right. Well, there's that quote that gets reposted all the time of Joe Biden saying, if there was no Israel, we would need to create one, which is, I think, in some cases a little taken out of context. But there is an idea too that, once there's no need to create something, if there is this global cooperation, if there is, Turkey renaming itself so that it can become more European, and Iran is making these things, and this is the Trump 2.0 playbook, right? The first Trump was kind of at war with China and, in the trade war, sure. But now Trump is more of the opinion that he can make a good deal with anyone, that he will be the person to deal with the Europeans, to deal with the Canadians, to deal with the Chinese. And there's a weird dance he plays where, obviously the trade war and the tariffs and all this stuff has been incredibly divisive. But he's always open to meeting people. He's always open to, going to Saudi Arabia and doing this thing. And yeah, it makes sense that, yeah, I just think that it totally kind of undermines the position of the Israelis, which is that, no, we really need to exist because it's the Wild West out here. There are these crazy fundamentalist dictatorships that aren't willing to play ball with the global order, but we're this stronghold. And that's why we have to do, commit atrocities and live next to open air prisons and steal homes and shoot children and do all these things. And once that starts to fall apart, it's very much like, you have some explaining to do. What necessitates a lot of the stuff that you have going on, and what necessitates basically Israel as a state or as an identity, once these places basically start to join the new global order in this way through, again, America, which is essentially Israel's closest ally. Once they start making deals with Israel's enemies, it's, kind of like the enemy of the enemy is my friend. But once those sort of battle lines start to dissipate and disappear, and we move further into globalism, I think it becomes really, really difficult for their identity to justify itself.
But it's a new kind of globalism. Let's be precise about that. This is not liberal globalism. Sure. It's and the hypocrisy that I think this Trump 2.0 globalism represents I mean, alongside the obvious sort of paradoxical features of Trump's new protectionist policies, rewriting global trade, using tariffs as a strategy to do so, beginning to engage in some kind of deflation of the US dollar, and trying maybe to supplement reduced financial hegemony with really existing military hegemony, or again, trying to get some kind of, Pax Trump, if you will, in which you can get a series of interconnected global deals, which is a highly complicated affair, and I think ultimately a dubious one. But to me, the hypocrisy that becomes obvious is that the state of Israel was not created because of the Holocaust. And it wasn't, I'm convinced, even created for the great progressive values of democracy and to install them in the Middle East, because liberal globalism, neoliberal globalism, has meant the expansion of markets and of commercial activity under the umbrella of democracy, and you have endless wars for two particular reasons. One, because you need to maintain the right to reinforce the supremacy of the American dollar, right? So when a force is being anti-democratic in the sense in which the Americans mean it, what they mean is they're being anti-commercial, they're being anti-American interests, they're not allowing American capital to go wherever it wants and buy whatever it wants. But it also basically means that, the American military-industrial complex, which everyone seems to know about, but nobody really knows how it works, is something that relies upon endless wars, because you need a constant refilling, literally, of the supplies, a refilling of the coffers, and a constant renegotiation and reaffirmation of investment, quite literally, in the American companies, in the American defense contracts that underpin this, whether it's, again, through actual purchase and procurement orders, or it's through buying shares in these companies themselves to the American stock market. This is the structure. So to try, when this structure has been reliant upon a form of neoliberalism, which has been massively global, right? Capital can go anywhere. Democracy cannot be hindered in its tracks. You get an Israel, which I think temporarily has the charisma of being the ultimate progressive force. Again, not because actually it has anything to do with Judaism or the Jewish people or the events of World War II. But you also get this difficulty that Trump will have to negotiate now, as far as how are you going to maintain a deal with the rest of the world that, as far as I can tell, is not going to benefit anyone unless they can massively outcompete the Americans in defense, in manufacturing, in capital, but do so without the global institutions that, since at least the 1970s, and to an extent the 1940s and 50s, have reinforced this thing called the global economy. We've had, whether it's the UN or the World Trade Organization or the IMF or Bretton Woods, or again, since the 1970s, the kind of glorious decoupling of the US dollar from fixed exchange rates, and the massive explosion of private finance, when private finance itself is now in conflict with the United States, because the Americans do not want to recycle everyone's surpluses. They don't want to be the deficit country that buys everyone's goods, but then says, okay, if we're going to buy your goods, you keep your money here, you buy American real estate, American debt, American stocks. When that's broken down, I'm not sure on what basis the global economy rests.
Right. Well, and it's also sort of just like, how does anything fit into this? I mean, it's what we see with, Carney's plan too, even in Canada, to supercharge, percentage of GDP spending on military, all the NATO targets, everything that's happening in Europe. It really becomes difficult, I think, to justify in anyone's mind, even culturally, when you hear that, the first big thing that Carney does is let's increase our defense spending in a major way. I think it's very difficult for the average person to even kind of start to comprehend in what way that will pay them back in a meaningful way. I think it's very difficult to negotiate.
But I'm not sure it is a cultural problem. I mean, it's there isn't a coherent defense for Carney's militarism. Right. Because one, there isn't an obvious war that we're supposed to be participating in. all there seems to be is the fantasy that we can go back to the pre-Trump era and have our good liberal endless wars back, on the basis of which enormous parts of the financial system rely, whether in practice, as I just mentioned, or just in theory. But again, wars are useful as a concept for global finance. And maybe it's not an outsized portion of our global economy when we have good endless wars over there, whether they're in the Middle East or in Africa or elsewhere. The proximity of the conflicts now seems to be worrisome. Again, Ukraine is an obvious new benchmark. In Canada, a little bit less obvious, but Russia, of course, is considered to be the dominant threat, and China as well. So the cultural stakes of trying to explain militarism are not going to come down to, patriotism or nationalism, right. Very old ideas. It's not been obvious how we've ever regulated war in the neoliberal era. I mean, people were very confused even when Iraq was happening, what exactly was happening. The extent to which the media was involved, not simply in fabricating stories, but fabricating the war, fabricating the what the war itself as a political instrument was responding to in terms of the reflexive goals of empire, of the American empire. But where we are now in this post-2008, post-pandemic, Trump 2.0 era, it seems to me that Carney, along with the Europeans, are having to rethink global stability without the supremacy of American finance or being able to have the Americans recycle their surpluses. The result is, well, okay, where are we going to get the center for global society? The pastiche of endless wars seems attractive. And even Carney's references to, even the fact that housing is read in terms of a post-war effort is about the only, I think, smidge of culture you're going to get to reinforce these military plans.
Right. Isn't it crazy to think about the fact that things like Afghanistan and Iraq and all these things were very easy. I mean, it took, as you say, a coordinated effort by the media to advocate for, but it was very easy to go, 9/11 happens, we're under direct threat, and then of course there's this democracy in the Middle East, or there's this concept of democracy that's totally under threat by crazy fundamentalist government. There's some kind of patriotic duty because the threat is now at home. There's some semblance of you're being valiant and you're engaging. People don't process it in the empire way, but yes, you're going to go over there, you're going to instill democracy, uplift all these people, but it takes some brute force first to achieve whatever this utopian vision is. But now we're so far removed from it. The threat is so non-present to people like Canadians and even Americans in many cases, that it becomes entirely symbolic. Basically, it's like, okay, literally like, Ukraine are these good guys. Look at Zelensky. Look at what's happening. They have funny TV shows. Russia is evil, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with Israel, Palestine. It becomes this idea that, America stands for something, or Canada stands for something, or Western democracy, liberal values, all these things really mean something. These people are engaging in this same project as us. We have to support them in building this project, I guess, with the goal being some kind of global utopia. But again, if you're really in Canada, if you're really in America, and things like your wage contract, your housing contract, your education contract are breaking down, the idea that you can convince someone that something, halfway across the world stands for this thing, which you are living through the collapse of, I think it becomes really, really difficult to justify and to take stock of as kind of an average person.
Good opportunity, I think, to look at European militarization. I mean, it's something we spoke about last week. We've been talking about for months. But in the context of war, and trying to understand, I think, a little bit that problem you just really introduced, the problem of when these values are collapsing, but you need war, to be blunt, economically. What do you do? Well, the first thing, just to be as precise as possible theoretically, is there are two different ways, I think, at the moment in which you can need war economically. I think we've been involved in trying to coordinate the differences. There's this liberal version, right, of the endless war. And then there's this new version, which we maybe want to call kind of post-liberal. And it's not necessarily negotiated by American or European actors, right? So it's negotiated by Israel, or it's negotiated by Russia, or by Ukraine, sort of for Europe and the world by proxy. These are not so. Not only is there this intimacy then of interests, especially in the European theater, it hasn't been anything like this really since the 1990s in Yugoslavia, and even then, probably not since World War II in terms of the scale. But these are two different ways of making. No, I wouldn't be so crude as to say making money from war. In fact, this is now a good opportunity to say, well, what exactly is there to be gained? We might say sort of politically and economically from Europe trying to turbocharge what we might call sort of Castle Europe, or the war project of Europe. And what they have are a set of basic historical conditions and then a set of reflective goals. Their historical conditions are basically, well, since World War II, they've been dependent on the United States. When it was during the fixed exchange rates, Europe was a coal and steel cartel. And like any business, they wanted fixed exchange rates. That's good for them. When the Americans unfixed the exchange rates, when the US was no longer tied to the Bretton Woods standard, suddenly the Americans were saying, okay, well, good luck. It's our dollar. You need to figure out your own situation. It took 30 years for the Europeans to come up with the euro. And even when they came up with the euro, they didn't come up with any actual political center. That means there's no social or cultural center to Europe. There's no way of saying, and this is a sort of classic economic example, of saying, well, we have this monetary union, but you need a politics so that you can have a functional macroeconomy on the basis of which you can have something like the euro bond, i.e., really solid European debt that people want a piece of. People want to invest in you. They want to invest in the industries of Europe to enhance their productivity. They want a piece of the European pie. But because of the dependencies since the 1970s of the Europeans on the Americans, which have basically been this dependency I already mentioned, well, the Europeans are going to continue to actually have a trade surplus with the United States. But the catch is going to be that all of the profits are going to be recycled through Wall Street. Again, through buying American shares, through buying American real estate, through buying American debt or bonds. And the result, and it's kind of obvious, is like, well, then are they going to put any money into actually increasing industrial productivity? Well, for a time, nobody will notice, But, 25 years on from the euro now and 2008, and the only coordinated strategy we've seen from the Europeans has been austerity, which means lowered incomes for everyone and massive monetary printing for the few, for the rich, which means average people don't have money to buy anything, which means the corporations don't want to build anything for them to buy, so they go and buy their shares. And this has been the result of austerity, is to turbocharge the massive amounts of debt while productivity in Europe continues to ail, and has ailed because this trade surplus dependency was never going to result in American companies who would then take those profits of the European companies themselves and go back and invest in Europe. But these investments were not, done on the basis of anything but commercial pursuit. So when they go and buy a European company, they could not care less about, but how is industrial productivity doing? They care about the vaster global program of managing the interests of the US dollar and the financial supremacy of the United States. But worse yet, they just didn't have, you can't expect Americans to care about Europe politically, culturally, socially. So, there's been no actual political center in Europe, like, ever. And the European Union has not been it, not unlike Israel, not really being the state that's meant to reinforce, Jewish, identity and rights and life, mainly because it had to be passed through the sieve of the liberal state, which was never going to be a good container for such a substantive political project. The European Union is no different. And the monetarization of Europe has been an absolute disaster. Again, it's given all the levers of control to European lawmakers to make as much money available as possible for corporations and financiers and the European elite, while ignoring totally the many of Europe.
Yeah, well, I think that leads us nicely into the G7, right? So Mark Carney, our leader, is meeting with many leaders at the moment, and I think there's an element of they want to find some kind of center like you have described, right? Mark Carney is a guy who comes into politics with this idea of bringing morality back into markets. Canada being this very moral, upstanding country, talking about good values, all these things. And I think that a lot of the negotiations and a lot of the discussions and projects that he engages in reflect this, right? He talks often about how in the post-war we built houses for Canadians who need houses. Now we want to do that again. We want to reduce, hardships on working families, all these things that politicians constantly say. But I think that Mark Carney comes at it, in this way where he wants to find perhaps that emotional core, moral center, all these things related to politics, related to state identity. And so I wonder what you think, if that's sort of the story of Europe and it's now coming to this kind of tragic, I don't know if you want to call it a conclusion or an end, but an end of something, or, perhaps an admission that there was actually never anything. What do you think it looks like, or what should the kind of topic of conversation be for someone like Mark Carney or someone like us and our listeners to try to find some basis for a new contract or for a new, method of operation?
Well, I think Europe believes that Russia is a threat and that Ukraine needs to be helped. And of course they think this because they've been unable to do much about it. At least two levels. One, they've not been able to productively support Ukraine, and certainly not without the Americans. And now the Americans are disinterested. So that's a difficulty for them. But they've not been able to take responsibility for the expansionary plans and programs of NATO, right? They've not been able to deal with the free fall of the Trump administration and basically wanting to reinforce one part of NATO and ignore another. I mean, NATO is a business. Some people say that, NATO basically sells protection. It's a good way of understanding it. But there are two different ways. Again, you can sell protection. And you can sell protection as a giant military industry if you're the Americans and you want to radically transform your military industrial base. But it's not enough as a monetary effort. And the Americans are not just seeking to do it as a monetary effort. Like the Europeans are having to think of it exclusively as a monetary effort because they don't have any other supports. They don't have a procurement strategy, right? These are the basic critiques of Europe as far as turning them into military Keynesianism, or they don't have a procurement strategy. They don't have a sovereign currency. They just have the euro that it doesn't actually have a political backing. It just is a monetary union. They don't really have, quote unquote, federal institutions, and they don't have a political center in the first place that could say, well, but what are our values or our interests? So when you look at Carney, to me, the whole thing about values is a giant piece of theater. I don't take it very seriously. I think it's a good example of what the role of politicians is right now, which is to sell as best as they can the system, in an attractive enough way, or worse yet, to give this impression that you have to make a choice between something like Trump's values and our values, but they're both market denominated, so I'm not really sure what the difference is. There are differences, and there's differences in terms of, what's the fantasy of Trump's global order versus the fantasy of Carney's. To me, Carney is having to do an enormous amount of crisis management. Will the Europeans be able to help him? I don't think so. I mean, what are they looking for right now when they meet in Alberta in the G7? I mean, like, Canada is in a very different place because we sort of, we don't maybe have a great procurement strategy, but we at least have a unified country. We have our own currency. We have our own, kind of properly kind of politicized debt system. We have our own politics. We have these sort of central powers, institutions, and authorities. We're not like the Americans. We don't have the robustness, the rigor, the capital, the experience. In that sense, Canada's also been like ultra dependent on the United States. But maybe I return to a paradox we've already spoken about. Like, I just don't see how, one, Canada and the European Union can do anything without a global center, without the Americans. It's not obvious to me what institutions they're coming up with. Are they going to come up with the Bretton Woods? They're going to come up, like, they just want the old institutions back. But those institutions were already post-1970. things like the IMF, things like the WTO. Oh, let's just have fair rules on global trading, which in a world of liberalism is also a giant bit of theater. It is very, again, any more than democracy has to do with people's actual right to express themselves or democratic choice. So I just see a big kind of Frankenstein's monster at the moment in Carney's plan and in the attempt to come up with a globalism without the United States.
Yeah, well, I wonder, I mean, the thing that we often talk about is we love to respond to, Varoufakis's stuff about, turning everything into an app. And again, we talk about, people like Wob, who is literally doing that. I mean, I wonder what like, how do we move past this financialization as the core of everything, and towards, like, as we sometimes talk about, basically operating on more real analog information, moving past price and market and all these signifiers and these motivators that seem to have failed us in this way. I mean, quite frankly, oftentimes my thinking with all of the politicking and NATO and all of this stuff is that, it's quite brutal that we still exist in a world where a great way to make money is through war. And what does it mean to perhaps move beyond that? Not only from a moral center in a more real way, but also from a logical perspective.
Personally, I think we should not talk about morality in this context. I don't think that what's wrong with the war or profiteering is a moral problem. In fact, I actually think that's very convenient for those in power for you to think of it as a moral problem. Because if you think of it as a moral problem, then there's an obvious choice: support Ukraine, support Israel, right? If there's a bifurcation in terms of should I support Palestine? Again, look to the leftist answer to what to do about Palestine. What's their biggest? Yes, let's arrest the forces of genocide. But you better have a good strategy for what the European Union is going to do instead. And this is what strikes at the core of why is there profit in war? It has, I think, very little to do with the fact that war is another industry and we're simply not moral enough. And a lot more to do with, certainly this latest turn to militarism, which is a worldwide phenomenon right now. That's what we're seeing. The greater technologization of war. Again, what are they going to be talking about the G7? Probably a lot about trying to piece together some procurement strategies for military technologies, trying to get AI as involved as possible. Again, further rely upon AI as this big source of growth potential. In other words, ignore all the productivity issues because they don't know how to solve them. The productivity issues go back to these dependencies that Europe has, that Canada has. Maybe Carney is, he's at least saying we have to decouple from the United States, but he doesn't know what else to do. So militarism is the other thing to do. Militarism is a kind of, it's not financialism. It's had intensely financial components. We describe those in terms of the endlessness of war, endless war syndrome. But the militarism right now is an attempt to reinvent productivity, to try and get back this missing link. And where Canada and Europe, that they have different issues, different challenges, and different histories, are are kind of responding to the fact that they no longer have kind of mother's teat in the form of America. They can't just send all of their surplus capital through the United States and continue to export to the United States. So what are they going to do? Militarization, which is going to come in the form of austerity in Europe, which means it's going to be another way to have the many take enormous budgetary cuts to fund wars, right? Where it'll continue to be a cabal or cartel of, Rheinmetall or Lockheed Martin or Leopard or any of these companies in terms of the corporate control and the corporate definition of what we mean when we talk about militarism, right? What do all these procurement strategies result in? Well, us acquiring a bunch of missiles or a bunch of tanks. So the idea is, can you use military productivity to get back your societal productivity, right? Why is this such a crazy but also tragic idea? Because people are unable to think through how they can get global economic stability. Europe is not ready to figure out its politics. It has no idea how to get a political center. Therefore, they can't have a stabilized macroeconomy. They can't have stabilized debt. They can't have proper fiscal strategies. Nothing. Canada, again, is a little bit too small for this to be an entirely realistic discussion, it sounds as if Carney wants to continue to be a big export nation with, energy superpower, among other things, and Canadian steel and aluminum and potash, etc. But it seems as though, if you build the product, like, where is that productivity going to come from? Not only is it not actually just a monetary problem, but when you don't have the guarantee of the Americans, in fact, you actually have the opposite of a guarantee, but active aggression. And productivity is the underlying issue that drives you towards militarism. Presumably, if you wanted to not militarize, you'd have to have a pretty good strategy for talking about productivity right now.
Well, I think that kind of gets us back to sort of like the second part of the question there, which is, we've started talking again about what would non-financial or non-military productivity actually look like, and how can that be achieved through things like, engaging more realistically with the digital, moving beyond market paradigms that have existed for 500 plus years, not relying on these old-fashioned systems. We talked last time about, using lumber as an example and sort of getting more to the core of what's really happening about, things like maturity and soil and all of these things. I think that we talk sometimes about how if we looked at what's quite literally productive, or if we had more meaningful definitions of data, then we could be more productive in a more, I don't know if you want to call it real or holistic or meaningful or productive way. But how do we move, towards that? Kind of forget Carney, forget the G7, but in terms of our thinking.
I don't think of it as a return towards some kind of pre-existing holistic productivity. I think that, I don't think economic productivity is not productive, and that there's some other form of holistic productivity waiting around the corner. I think this is exactly the illusion to avoid, especially when you start talking about alternatives to markets and you talk about the internet. You talk about, is there a kind of information on the internet that is better than price information and price signaling and a price system? I mean, the sort of lesson of the 20th century, in part, is even the most extreme deviations from capitalism in the form of, say, the Soviet Union was still a market-denominated phenomenon. They basically just synthesized a price system. They didn't get rid of prices. They didn't get rid of markets. And they didn't get rid of something which we might call economic or market productivity. They just used huge amounts of bureaucracy, and in a rather desperate, tragic, and ultimately disastrous way. The success of market productivity in the West has less to do with our having figured out, the true and democratic, liberal, humanitarian consensus, which is markets. Because if that was true, then the enduring market logic of the Soviet Union would have, to some extent, maintained the Soviet Union's enterprises. And in a rather ironic way, it kind of sort of did. In terms of the Cold War went on for 45 years, without any satisfactory resolution, until, slowdowns and led to not, suddenly the Soviet Union is going to become a market democracy. But suddenly they're just going to accept that they've been doing a kind of delayed market society already. And there's nothing in the Soviet Union that, to me, has the conditions of a genuine alternative. Figuring out an alternative, and again, if you look at, our modern solution in the internet, which for many people, I think, increasingly is not a solution to anything, and trying to deal with the problem of productivity. Again, productivity is a social concept. We itemize certain social goals. We create processes for achieving those goals. And we call those processes productive, which seem to achieve those goals most effectively. But even effect or efficiency or time scales are also all, imported social ideas. All the internet does for me is it reinvents the concept a little bit of the social. It gives us a new way of thinking about the social as a technology. People like Yanis Varoufakis, who again we talk about all the time and support deeply, but his solution is to get that strategy of, well, why don't you make more resilient the macroeconomic structure, say, of the European Union? Why don't you actually start investing in productivity? What does that mean? Invest in industry. get those companies to actually invest in their own productive facilities. Right now, Germany is like literally deindustrializing. Varoufakis cites a number. He says that in the last 15 years, there's been net zero investment in productivity. Net zero in Europe. Like, what a crazy figure. And what that means is that the Europeans are not investing, in net terms into their own industrial productivity. And then again, this is what creates a toxic swirl where then they need a war. So again, a war is not a moral category. Again, it's a way of actually continuing economics by other means. And it's radically overdetermined by illusions that we have about why are we in this situation? Where did our productivity contracts? Why doesn't belt tightening just work? Well, why do we print so much money? Why does the system need endless monetary printing to survive? And you think, well, we're not willing to face the ideological distortions about, and we cannot just figure out the politics. Varoufakis' movement is DiEM25, and it's like, well, but where's the actual demand for a political center? Like, what are the political principles of DiEM25? I don't really know. To me, the appeals at the moment to Gaza are not good enough. They're kind of the opposite of good enough. They're kind of just obscurantist and vague, because references to genocide are not enough for a political program. There is no point at which it will be bad enough that people will say, okay, that's enough. I actually think that's the scary thing about what's happening in Gaza. People should recognize that a political consensus or a political transformation is not going to emerge if you just show more dead people. I thought we already learned that with the Holocaust. Death is not enough for politics in either way, whether you want to use it productively or not. So getting that political center, or trying to use what for me is not old-fashioned but still very much an economic idea of, well, but if we can have really good European debt and have them invest, putting the money into their own industrial facilities, well, what is it, that markets will work? Varoufakis says this concept of markets without capitalism, which would mean you can have investment and productivity and coordinated fiscal structures on the basis of a politically centralized Europe. But maybe that hasn't happened because Europe doesn't want to be politically centralized. Maybe this is part of the unconscious that explodes in terms of Europe's guilt, which Varoufakis also talks about in the context of the Holocaust and the modern relationship of the European Union to Israel, and its massive support of Israel through, and it goes both ways, through European defense technologies, but also massive amounts of Israeli investment in universities in Europe. It's incredibly incestuous. So using something like the internet is a way to maybe move beyond the fiction or dream of a unified Europe right now. And maybe this holds for Canada, and maybe for the United States, and for anywhere, and trying to find the source of political centrality, and therefore the kind of reflectively and sort of dependently significant concepts of unified fiscal strategies and investment strategies. I think the internet seems to replace, it's not that it's decentral, but it does replace something about, we need a politics of like unified nations. I think I'm skeptical of these paradigms and the economics that support them, and reflectively interested in the internet because it doesn't seem to need this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I guess for me, in your estimation, what does something like that look like? Like how does leveraging the internet help us to move past that, or what would even something look like that moves past that?
Well, the internet allows you to rethink information, and when you rethink information, you don't have to rely upon this very naive idea that information is just out there because objects are just out there and society just exists. Clearly society does not just exist. Society itself is the political project par excellence. You have to kind of, not only do we see this in terms of what narrative do we even use to coordinate our politics? Are you pro-Israel? Are you pro-Palestine? Are you pro, Trump or not? I mean, like, the narrativization here of society is unconsciously regulated by information that we get from commercial activity, from the assumption that at the end of the day, whether there's a war, there's a valid and universal basis in which I can go and generate not profit. Commercial activity has nothing to do with making money. It has to do with making a certain kind of information that the system can run on. I can run on the information of, so long as I have that universal basis, which can turn even a war into a piece of information, I have some universal basis on which to regulate society. What's crazy is since 2008, we've just invented this information, with monetary printing. We've synthesized the information massively. And what's been revealed is that even before 2008, maybe going back a long while, what we've meant by productivity, by consumer products, by commodities, by markets and free trade have been a series of fictions, regulating fictions, that only work if this universal basis of information continues to function. But the moment you show that you can synthesize it with money, with massive monetary printing and austerity for the rest of us, that you can decouple the stock market from the actual economy, that you can have corporations that can continue to have their stock prices explode because they choose to buy back their own shares and not invest in anything, and that you can have eventually this kind of total schizophrenia in terms of the average person doesn't really know why they're paying more money than ever, whether it's into their tax systems or whether it's into regular prices, from food to clothing, etc., and why we actually do still put, European Union has put trillions of dollars in defense over the last couple of decades, and yet where has it gone? So that dysphoria about why are we spending more than ever and having to spend more than ever, and why is aggregate demand so low, and why are we deindustrializing, and why do we even have productivity issues? But our debt is exploding. That gap shows you that this information, again, long before 2008, was always already a kind of fiction that could work without us actually verifying that there was a quote unquote realistic basis. Real objects and real transactions and real people and real industrial movement. The problem is that this has sort of shattered our concept of reality. So how do you get reality back? The only answer I can give, for the time being is, well, the internet is an answer to the question of reality. It's an answer to the question of how to find a different universal basis for information and its production, right? Not just information that is already there, but that people don't create products when they're on the internet, don't produce prices in the final analysis, but produce information about human society on the basis of which you can make massive and radical and unifying and collective political decisions.